fossils to speak of really below that. And then all of a sudden we start getting a lot. What does that say to you as a paleontologist?
Well, the great unconformity is telling me that there's some sort of massive erosion and shearing that's happening across the continent. And then once we start getting to those nice sedimentary rocks that have all the wonderful fossils in them, the pattern starts to emerge. The ecosystem that has the first animals in it shows up very suddenly. In conventional paleontology, they call this the Cambrian explosion. It's the first appearance of a wide diversity of different types of marine animals. All of a sudden, you have this complex and whole ecosystem that shows up basically out of nowhere. Now, that makes perfect sense from a creation and flood perspective because the flood is about destroying ecosystems. Whereas in an evolutionary view, these ecosystems are going to have to arise a little bit more gradually as organisms diversify and evolve and respond to one another in their environment. But that's not what you see. Instead, you see an explosion of life that is complex, whole. The ecosystem is integrated with one another. You can see where all the different organisms fit with respect to one another. And that's just the first time that happens. Every time you move up in the geological column in this fossil record, you start seeing snapshots of more and more ecosystems. You've got one ecosystem that's destroyed, and then you've got another one. It's got slightly different creatures. There's different interactions going on. And as the floodwaters move higher and higher, they're getting closer and closer to shore, destroying more and more organisms in the shoreline and eventually up onto land.
Yeah. So I think I see what you're saying here, and that is that the paradigm that we're all taught, that conventional paradigm, is trying to tell us that the fossil record is an evolutionary picture of life as it is developing, as opposed to the Genesis paradigm that's saying, no, all of that life, all the complexity of life already was there, and now we're looking at the graveyard of all that life.
Exactly.
Well, what are some of the other data that you're seeing that convinces you of this paradigm?
Sure. Well, one very curious situation with the fossil record, so thinking vertically about things, is not the hard parts of the animal, but the trackways. They're the footprints. This is a pattern that we see in several different groups where their footprints are first and their body parts are later. For the trilobites, for the amphibians, for the dinosaurs, the first time I find evidence of them in the fossil record, it's from trackways, not hard parts. From an old Earth perspective, that's really weird and hard to grapple with because you have millions of years between the trackway production and ultimately the animal that made it. But that obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because if there's trackways, there's animals, and those animals have bones and teeth and shells to them. Why aren't they fossilized? Instead, the pattern is telling us something different. There's no time between when somebody leaves a track and when somebody gets buried.
But the fact that those trackways are still there, that should tell us something as well, shouldn't it?
One, it tells us that the deposition or the placement of the next layer on top of them had to happen very, very quickly. Because, again, you go out onto a beach and you walk in the sand, your trackways are destroyed very, very quickly. But the fossil record is showing us something very different from today. This is death in a moment, right? This is death in an instant. And we're talking about a world that was complex, whole, integrated, and the flood is destroying that world sequentially and burying it in a vertical fashion. And so I think looking at the fossil record as a record of life is partly correct, but it's not about life's development. It's about life's attempt to survive an event that ultimately consumed all of them.
Well, that would make sense then, because when God was talking about destroying the earth with the flood, it wasn't just the destruction of human life, it was the destruction of all life. And so now the world we live in is, as you said, radically different than what that was before.
Yeah. When we look at the T-Rex, when we look at the mosasaurs, when we look at all these animals as ferocious carnivores, and they really are, I mean, they're terrifying, but that's not what they were initially created to be. And so these sharp teeth, these devastating claws, and the behaviors that go along with them all seem to be part of the curse. And part of that is genetic. Part of it might also be just some modifications. But these organisms, by the time we see them, and this is important for us to remember when we come to a natural history museum, is you're not seeing the world at Creation Week. You're seeing the world as it existed at the flood. And that world was one that was filled with violence and was a pretty terrible place to be.
I realized that the billions of creatures buried in those layers are a silent testimony to God's global judgment. I decided I wanted to see one of those layers of fossils for myself. If the dinosaurs had died suddenly in the flood, wouldn't it be obvious?
What we're dealing with here, this is in the Lance Formation. This is a Upper Cretaceous sedimentary deposit. And what we have here is what's called a bone bed. It's an accumulation of bones that's about 1 meter thick, a little less than 1 meter. And in this meter, we find the bones present as a graded bed with little bones at the top and bigger bones at the bottom. And you can see here, looks like Kirline is working on another vertebra here. This is a cervical vertebra of a duck-billed dinosaur. This is where the spinal cord goes right there. Mm-hmm. When I look at these bones in the quarry, I often think of them as being inside the animal alive, and just imagine what it's like to be seeing these bones for the first time. So this is just full of bones, and it's not like we have to go looking for where the bones are. We just have to sit down and start digging.
What is mainly different about the sites that you're digging here as opposed to what we would say a general dinosaur dig somewhere?
Well, there are dinosaurs found all over the world, but this particular site is unique in that it's probably one of the largest collections of bones in the world. And there are